I had been driving for hours through the thick forest roads of the Pacific Northwest. My GPS had lost signal a while ago, and I was starting to feel very alone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I needed to find a place to stay for the night. Just as I began to worry, I saw a small sign pointing to a cabin rental. The road was narrow and bumpy, but I followed it anyway. The cabin appeared almost out of nowhere, sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. It looked old but solid, the kind of place where you might get away from everything. I parked my car and walked up to the door. It was unlocked, and inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The place was simple: a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom with a single bed. I put down my bag and decided to light a fire, hoping the warmth would make me feel better. Night came quickly, and the forest around me seemed to close in. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the cabin. I made myself some dinner from the food I had in my car, ate quickly, and decided to go to bed early. Lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was too perfect, too complete. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a faint rustling outside. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up and looked out the window. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon casting eerie shadows. I saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it, went back to bed, and pulled the covers up tight. Sleep wouldn't come. Every sound seemed louder in the stillness of the night. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked in response. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard a soft but clear sound, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart pounding, I slipped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. I moved quietly to the window, trying to see into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the night, but I saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to check outside, just to make sure. I opened the door slowly, the hinges squeaking. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stepped onto the porch. Shining the flashlight around, I saw no one. But then, at the edge of the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, partly hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape. I called out, hoping it was another lost traveler or a local. No response. The figure didn't move. I backed into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it someone looking for help? Or someone with bad intentions? I didn't want to find out. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, the fire long since burned out. The figure never came closer, never moved. It just watched. As dawn broke, the figure finally disappeared into the forest. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, threw them in the car, and drove off without looking back. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire drive home. Later, I learned that the area had a history of people going missing, their cases never solved. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever, or whatever, I saw that night was linked to those disappearances. The cabin, once a safe place, became a nightmare in my memory. And though I never saw the figure again, I couldn't help but feel that it was still out there, somewhere, watching and waiting for its next victim. I decided to spend a weekend camping in the forest to escape the busy city. The first day went well. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of nature. By nightfall, the crackling fire and the distant hooting of owls made me feel relaxed. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a hike. The trail was beautiful, with sunlight shining through the trees and birds singing. But as the day went on, dark clouds started to gather. I decided to head back to camp to avoid getting caught in the rain. By the time I got back, it had started to drizzle. I quickly gathered my things and put them inside the tent. The rain soon turned into a heavy downpour. I huddled inside, listening to the heavy drops hitting the tent. It was then that I noticed a strange sound, a rustling, too close to my tent to be just the wind or rain. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my nerves. But the rustling grew louder and more constant. I peeked out of the tent's flap and saw nothing but dark shapes and shadows. My mind raced, thinking of wild animals or, worse, a person lurking out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, moving the beam across the campsite. Nothing. Just trees and the endless rain. But the sound continued, now seeming to move around me. My heart pounded as I realized it was no longer just rustling. It was the sound of someone, or something, moving through the bushes. I decided to get out of the tent and check it out. I walked carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the rain. My footsteps were almost silent on the wet ground. Suddenly, I saw a figure crouching near my food supply. It was a man, drenched, trying to steal my food. He looked just as scared as I was when our eyes met. He stumbled back, mumbling something I couldn't hear over the rain. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. Seeing he wasn't a threat, and was probably just as desperate as I was, I signaled for him to come closer. We both took shelter under a nearby tree, where the rain wasn't as heavy. I gave him some food and water, and we sat there in silence, listening to the rain. Eventually, the rain stopped, and the man, after thanking me, disappeared back into the forest. I never found out who he was or why he was out there, but I was glad the encounter ended peacefully. I packed up my things the next morning and left the campsite, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the car, I breathed a sigh of relief and drove away, promising myself I wouldn't camp alone again. Weeks later, I read a news report about a missing person last seen in the same forest. The description matched the man I had seen. They never found him. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and I wonder if he ever really left the forest, or if something else found him first. Driving through the thick forest, I finally got to the cabin I had rented for a week. It was supposed to be a break from the craziness of city life. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by tall trees and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow any noise. The nearest neighbor was miles away, which was exactly what I wanted. Unpacking my bags, I looked around the cabin. It had simple furniture, a stone fireplace, and the dim light of late afternoon coming through small windows. I set up my things, made a quick meal, and settled in for the night. The quiet was unsettling, but I told myself it was just my city nerves. The first night, I slept badly, waking up several times to the sounds of the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant animal call. By morning, I was tired but determined to enjoy my alone time. I spent the day hiking, exploring the woods, and trying to soak in the calm. But there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake, a sense of being watched. On the third day, I decided to explore a bit more. I found a path that led deeper into the forest, marked by old, worn-out signs. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I brushed it off as paranoia, but my steps got quicker. I eventually came upon an old, abandoned cabin, much smaller and more broken down than mine. Its windows were smashed, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The air around it felt colder. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside. The cabin was a mess, furniture broken, dust thick on every surface, and a lingering smell of rot. It looked like it had been left for years. I saw old photos scattered on the floor, but they were too faded to make out clearly. A strange sense of fear filled me, and I decided to leave. Back at my cabin, I couldn't shake the creepy feeling from the abandoned cabin. I tried to distract myself with a book, but every creak of the wood and rustle of leaves outside seemed louder. That night, I struggled to sleep again. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the back door. I froze, listening hard. The scratching continued, slow and steady. My heart raced as I crept to the door, peeking through the small window. Nothing. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and flung it open. The cold night air hit me, but there was no one there. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the fireplace, gripping a poker for comfort, waiting for the dawn. When daylight finally came, I packed my bags, ready to leave. This break wasn't worth the growing fear eating at me. As I loaded my car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the daylight, it looked harmless, almost inviting. But the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I quickly got in my car and started the engine. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. A few miles down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the rearview mirror, in the dust of my cabin, a single handprint, smudged and unmistakably human, was slowly fading away. I sped up, my heart pounding. A few days later, back in the city, I started to relax. But one night, I found dirt and pine needles scattered on my apartment floor. My front door was locked, and there were no open windows. That sense of being watched had followed me home. Now, I can't escape it. Every night, I hear faint scratching at my door. The feeling of being watched is stronger than ever. My apartment no longer feels safe. I keep all the lights on, hoping it will keep whatever is out there at bay. But deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before it gets in. I decided to spend the weekend at a cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful break from the city. The cabin was small but cozy, with a tiny kitchen, a living area, and a bedroom. There was no cell service, which was fine by me. I wanted to unplug. The first night was quiet. I spent the evening reading and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was nice. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. The woods were thick, but there were paths that made it easy to walk around. I walked for hours, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of nature. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The door was slightly open, which was strange because I was sure I had locked it. I went inside and looked around. Nothing seemed to be missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked the windows and the back door. All were locked. The second night was different. As I lay in bed, I heard noises outside. At first, I thought it was just animals, but then I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a soft knocking on the door. I stayed still, my heart racing. The knocking went on for what felt like hours but was probably just minutes. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin. They were human, but there were no other signs of who had been there. I decided to end my trip early. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I was relieved when I finally reached the main road and saw other cars. When I got home, I tried to forget about the experience. But a few days later, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was a single piece of paper with one sentence. "I know where you live." I moved out of the city the next month, changed my number, and never went back to that cabin. The fear stayed with me, a reminder that some places are better left alone. Months later, I was settling into my new home. The fear had started to fade, and I felt almost normal again. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on the door. My heart stopped. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door slowly and found another note on the floor. This one simply said, "You can't hide." I rented a small, remote cabin in the mountains for a weekend break. I wanted a peaceful escape from the city's noise, but from the moment I arrived, something didn't feel right. The cabin was old, and the forest around it was unusually quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination and got settled in. As night came, the temperature dropped quickly. The cabin creaked with every breeze, and shadows moved on the walls. I tried to relax by the fireplace, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, was watching me. Around midnight, I heard faint noises outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow, but when I looked out the window, the snow was untouched. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, or the wind playing tricks, but the noises kept coming and going through the night. Eventually, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, the cold biting at my face. The snow-covered ground was eerily quiet now, and the darkness seemed to swallow any sound. I walked around the cabin, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the night. I saw nothing unusual, just trees, shadows, and the empty snow. I went back inside, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment for letting my imagination get the best of me. The next morning, the snow was still pristine, untouched by any recent footprints. I packed my things and got ready to leave. While loading my car, I noticed something strange, a set of large footprints leading from the woods straight to the cabin. There were no other tracks around, which meant whoever, or whatever, made them had come from deep in the forest and walked right up to the cabin. The footprints were fresh, but the snow around them was undisturbed, showing they hadn't been there long. A chill ran down my spine when I realized that whoever had been outside last night might have been watching me from the shadows. I quickly finished loading my car, keeping a nervous eye on the surrounding woods. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, feeling both relief and a deep sense of fear. Months have passed since then, but the memory still haunts me. I still wonder who, or what, was out there, waiting just outside the cabin. The thought that someone might have been hiding in the darkness, watching me the whole time, is terrifying. The cabin has been vacant since my visit, and no one else has dared to stay there. But sometimes, I still hear that same crunching sound in the snow when I walk outside at night, and it's like a warning from the woods, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I stumbled across the cabin while hiking through the thick forest. It was old, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it might cave in any moment, but it seemed like a decent spot to spend the night. I was on a solo trip to relax and get away from everything, so the isolation felt just right. That night, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and curled up with a book. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak and sway. I was cozy and felt safe, despite the strange noises that seemed to get louder as the night went on. Around midnight, I heard a soft thump on the porch. I thought it might be a falling branch or an animal, but then I heard it again, more deliberate. It sounded like someone was tapping on the door. I checked the door and peeked outside, but there was no one there. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and went back to my book. The tapping kept going, getting louder and more urgent. It sounded like someone knocking on the wood. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on my reading, but my nerves were on high alert. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by a scraping sound coming from the window next to the door. I looked over, but saw nothing outside. I told myself it was just the wind messing with me. Just as I was about to settle back down, I noticed that the window was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I went to shut the window, but stopped when I saw something disturbing, muddy handprints smeared all over the glass. My heart raced. The cabin was far out. There shouldn't be anyone around here. I locked the window and bolted the door. My breathing was quick and shallow. The fire crackled loudly, but it couldn't drown out the noises outside. I listened closely, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like nails dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding. I shone the light around, but found nothing. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of someone or some animal. When I reached the back of the cabin, I saw something chilling. The ground around the base was disturbed, like someone had been digging there. I couldn't stay there another minute. I went back inside, packed up quickly, and decided to leave. As I was heading to my truck, I glanced back at the cabin. The firelight flickered through the windows, and that's when I saw it, a dark shape moving slowly behind the glass, pacing back and forth. I jumped in my truck and sped away, the cabin disappearing behind me. The drive back felt endless, and I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The next day, I told the local authorities about what happened. They investigated the cabin and found signs that someone had been living there recently: food wrappers, personal items, and a rough bed in the corner. They assured me the cabin was now secure, but they never found out who had been there or why. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of that dark shape moving behind the window, and the disturbing signs of someone's presence, left me with a feeling of constant dread. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can't shake the image of that shadow pacing slowly, waiting. I was excited to explore the far-off trails of the Cascade Mountains. The cool autumn air greeted me as I started my hike early one Saturday morning. The path twisted through thick pine forests, sunlight peeking through the trees and making strange shapes on the ground. I walked deeper into the wilderness, following the trail markers that assured me I was going the right way. Around noon, though, the markers became sparse, like the trail was fading into the bushes. As I kept going, I realized I hadn't seen another person for hours. The forest grew quieter, just the crunch of leaves under my feet. I felt a bit nervous being alone out there, but I pushed it aside. As the sun started to set, I decided to turn back, hoping to get back to the start before dark. But trying to find my way back was useless. The markers I had followed confidently had disappeared completely. Panic set in when I realized I was lost. With the light fading and no clear path, I stumbled through the woods, each step more unsure than the last. Shadows moved around me, and every sound made my heart race. Just as despair was about to take over, I saw a faint light through the trees. With hope, I moved towards it, praying it wasn't just my tired mind playing tricks. Stepping into a small clearing, I saw a familiar sight, a fallen tree I had passed earlier. Relief washed over me as I recognized where I was. Following the familiar ground, I finally found my way back to the main trail. Tired but relieved, I walked back to the start under the moonlit sky, promising myself never to underestimate the wilderness again. It wasn't just about getting back safe, but a lesson learned: the wild is unpredictable and demands respect.